Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, I guess it's okay. No, it's not.
Yeah, I'll turn that down. And now that's your tone. That shouldn't cause any trouble. You're gonna have to be pretty close to this, right? How close can we get to her?
Bad. And particularly. And she said, well, I guess if you talk about yourself, you'll have to be talking about the amalgamated clothing workers. And I said, well, that's true, because particularly for the last 35 years, I haven't had much private life. It's all been tied up with the labor movement here, particularly in the South. But I always, even when I'm speaking to a group of workers that we're trying to organize, I always try to tell them something about myself, because so many people have the idea that organizers are some kind of special breed that is hired by the different international unions to go out and recruit members. The fact is, the staff of our union, and as I believe most all unions, the officers and the staff come out of the membership, and the membership are employed in the industries that their union represents. I know that all the organizers and our business agents and the staff and the international officers of our union have been workers in our industry. That seems to be a myth, or that when you read in the paper about these professional organizers, it seems like that, and it just tears me up when they say that, because I think anybody's professional if they get paid for what they do, but it seems to have a tone of disrespect to it to me, like we're just out there for the money. Of course, everybody has to draw a paycheck or get some money from somewhere in order to live. Of course, during the Depression, some of us got by pretty good with very little money, but I don't believe that we could do as good today in the Depression as we did in the 30s. But actually, the people who are leading and trying to organize the labor unions are workers out of the plant who found it a necessity to band together for their common good. I can remember my first union meeting when I was 7 years old. I was born in Georgia. At the age of 5, my father moved the family to Alabama. And he was a carpenter, worked in the steel mills, and carried a union card. But since the union was not recognized by any of the firms, he couldn't let it be known that he was a member of a labor organization. So my mother was the one who went to all the union meetings and all the labor rallies, particularly during World War I, when they was trying to organize the steel mills in the South and the other textile industry, which was the largest industry in that area, and the mines. So she went to all the union meetings and all the rallies to report back to my father the progress it was making. So I went along. And I never shall forget, I guess, the first time I realized what the speakers were talking about. I said to my dad, what are labor unions? And he explained to me, and it's something that stuck in my mind ever since. He said, Eula, if you just live in this world and don't try to make it a better place. You're taking up space. You're just taking up space. Always try to better your lot in life and for the fellow workers, and do something toward making this a better country to live in. And that stuck with me all these years. I went to work in an industry, in the clothing industry, or the overall plant it was. There was not much clothing industry in the South before World War I, before World War II. See, I'm so old, I get the wars mixed up. I said something the other day to a young fellow about the war, and he said, "Which one?" So I forget to put the numbers on them sometime. But I went to work in a plant, and I won't go into the conditions that people worked under, but it was unbelievable. I went to work during school vacation one time. A girlfriend and I just thought we'd like to go get us a job. And I got an education that 3 months that I spent in that factory, that 3 months that I spent there. I really got an education in how people were treated. Later on, I found it necessary to have to quit school and to earn a living because my father became very sick with leukemia and disabled to work. I had to go to work in order to make a living, to help the family. And whenever I heard the organizers, and let me hasten to say, at that time we didn't have anything like paid organizers. The people who were union members in particularly the building trades, the railroad workers who had been organized and was more or less looked up to as the aristocrats of the laboring class of people, they were our organizers. They were people who tried to help us in the industrial plants to form unions. And when I heard that they were trying, I made every effort to find out who, because at that time there was no laws and you had to really know who you're talking to talk union. You had to know that you could trust this person or feel reasonably sure you could trust this people because they had the blacklist. And if you lost your job because you was thought to be a sympathizer with the union or a member of the union, they'd have these blacklists and they'd circulate them, and you start to get out to look for a job. They'd get that list out to see if your name was on it. So they were very careful who they talked to, and I had to travel way across town to work. Most of the people who worked in this shop lived in the area and walked to the plant. But because I came from the other side of town, my father being a steel worker, and us living on the other side of town out in Inslee, I had to ride a streetcar. And it took me an hour and a half. I got on the streetcar and had to come into town and transfer and ride out on the other side of town. It took me an hour and a half to get to work, and an hour and a half home, and sometime longer. If I happened to miss that connection, I'd have to stand in town till the next streetcar. And then working a 12-hour shift, it took me about 16 hours to put in, actually work 12 hours. So I had a little trouble finding out who was heading up the organizing committee. I found out and got very active in it, and we organized the plant. It wasn't easy. We had a lot of hardship. They closed the plant down. I lost my job. I got fired. And another lady, Ms. Robinson, who was in her 60s at the time, she got fired, and I got fired, and 2 of the men got fired. And to get a contract, why, the company didn't want to replace us, so we agreed not to take our job back in order to get a contract for the other people. And it was over a year before I ever found a job of any kind. And yeah, I was fortunate enough to be able to live at home. My sister's husband had a pretty good job, and I lived with her. So from then on, I have been a paid representative. Before that, I was doing what I could to try to help the labor movement on a voluntary basis. I worked with the Women's Trade Union League in Birmingham, and we did a good job to try to help the women workers in the Birmingham area, particularly. And for some of you people who may not know what the Women's Trade Union League was, it was responsible for the organization that I represent today. It was a group of women who had organized themselves to try to help the working conditions of women throughout industry. And they were the leaders that helped form the Amalgamated Clothing Workers of America in Chicago in 1914. This organization was made up of women who worked in factories. It was made up of women in politics, social workers, and some very prominent, wealthy women was involved in it. I know in Birmingham, we had the wife of a large dairy became interested. And it was quite amusing later when the union tried to organize the dairy. Her and her husband's confrontation about it. Of course, it did become a union, and I'm sure that they're not connected with the dairy today, but it's a union dairy today. But they did a lot of good for the women workers, not only in industry, but waitresses and women who did domestic work in homes. And out of that was formed the Amalgamated, as I said, in 1914, and they played a big part in our organization. I was glad to be associated with them because through them, I was able to meet, I think, one of the greatest women, certainly in my lifetime, and that was Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor Roosevelt was a woman that had a mind of her own and did whatever she thought necessary. That is, at times, when Franklin D. was in politics, and was governor of New York, and later President of the United States, she had to be a little more careful because she was afraid that what she might say or do would be reflecting his opinions and attitudes, and sometime I can assure you that wasn't true. But I was invited along with 4 more girls from Alabama to be her guest the first term that he was in office. And at the Women's Trade Union League convention in Washington, D.C. And they had us as guests of the President and Mrs. Roosevelt. Certainly an honor for me, and I think an honor for all working people. People who didn't like Roosevelt put out a book belittling some of their activities, and they wrote it in there that they lowered the dignity of the White House by having common everyday garment workers as their guests. Ms. Roosevelt always felt like the White House belonged to the country, and that she should be able to entertain the high as well as the low. I've always felt that just because I had to work for a living at a menial job didn't make me any less person. I always felt like I was just as good as anybody else. We have in the South, I can remember when we started organizing, there was not a single local union of the Amalgamated Clothing Workers anywhere in the South. I have seen times when I'd feel like that you'd go out and talk to people and you'd get nowhere. We've gone for months at a time without getting a single union card signed. And I have seen times when I think, well, it's a useless cause. It's just absolutely impossible to organize people into unions. And when I look today and see the close to 20,000 members we have in the 8 southern states, I'm proud of it, although we've just scratched the surface. We have a long way to go because there's a lot more unorganized than there are organized. But if you had to, or maybe you do know, if you talk to these workers, and the most confusing thing that I find, or the confusing thing to me, or the most frustrating thing to me, is to go and sit down and talk with a worker, say, well, I'd like to have a union. We need a union, and relate all the grievances and injustices that they think that goes on in the plant that they work in, to say, I'll lose my job. Absolutely have. It seems to be today they have more fear. I believe this. They have more fear today than did in the 30s. In the 30s, they joined the union. They didn't worry so much about losing that job because they had nothing. But today, I think today, so many people are buying homes and that second car, the boats, the televisions, and they're so burdened down with the installment plans. Now, this is purely my opinion from talking to all the people that I talked to, and I talked to a number of people in the course of a week or a year and trying to talk to them about joining the union. That they know if they lose that one paycheck and they miss a payment on some of these luxuries that they've bought, they're going to lose that. And they're living better than they've ever lived in their life, although they are living on the installment plan. So it's worse. To me, it's worse. The fear is worse among them today for that reason. Now, in the 30s, they were afraid, but they're afraid of physical harm. I can remember in Andalusia, Alabama, where we have a local union there today of over 2,000 members. But I can remember in the 30s going to Andalusia, Alabama, and I had a young man and his wife in the car with me, and they were taking me over to show me where a person lived. And we parked in front of the house of the man we was going to see, and 2 cars drove up, one in front of me and one in back of me, and blocked us, and pulled that young man and his wife out and beat them up right there in the street. And needless to say, that ended the organization because nobody else wanted that kind of treatment. And that went on a lot of people think that we make these, I'm sure a lot of people read, oh, well, it's just something they made up. I can assure you that I've seen a lot of violence where a person, you take the Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company in Gadsden, Alabama. When they were trying to organize during the 30s, they hired men to go to work in there like workers, but they was in there as spies. And they'd catch those men on the parking lot as they get off their shifts and beat them up. Some were left to die, and would have probably if they hadn't got help from some other worker. And the organizer, it just wasn't the organizer they were after. They was after any worker in the plant who voiced their sympathy or even spoke favorably about the union. Right over here in Thompson, Georgia, I went there one day just to see what that plant was making. And I was talking to the lady who lived near the plant, and I said, what do they make over there? And she said, pants. I said, you know who they make them for? And she said, no, I don't. I asked her 1 or 2 questions. She said, are you a union representative? Because that's the next thing they ask if you start asking questions. I said, yes, I am. But I'm not here. I hastened to put her at ease. I said, I'm not here to try to organize the plant. I'm here because I'm looking for some work that we think's a runaway work, and I'm trying to locate it to see because it's, our members are out of work in this other plant, and we think they're shipping the work out and having it made somewhere else, and that's what I'm looking for. She said, well, we need a union over there. But she said, let me tell you what happened. Just a few weeks ago, said my husband and some more men were talking in the restroom. And one of the men, they were talking about some things that had happened in the plant they didn't think was fair. And one of the men spoke up and said, what we need is a union. Well, she said, one of the men in the group went and told the boss, and they fired him for just merely saying what they need is a union. They do those things to stifle any idea of a union. They nap it in the bud before it spreads. Immediately, the word gets around, he got fired because of the union. And they spread that word. And that puts fear among any of the other. And the next man that raises his head will probably get the same thing. I was talking to Marie here before, and she said there was a lot of violence in the South. I said the labor movement has had a lot of violence all over, not just in the South. But I can remember in the 30s, we had threats from the Ku Klux Klan. It was amusing. The forces that was working against unions, amusing how far apart, I would think they would be. We had opposition. Well, we had opposition from everyone, I think, practically. Religion. We had opposition from the Ku Klux Klan, and certainly the Chamber of Commerce and manufacturers and businessmen's groups. But the attitude of the churches is something that I couldn't understand. I remember right here in Atlanta in 1936, there was a man came from Texas, and he was some big minister out in Texas. I can't recall his name. I'm afraid to say, I think it was Gerald H.K. Smith or something. I think that was his name. I won't say positive because it may not have been him, but I believe it was. But he was circulating in the Atlanta area, making talks against the union. And I was sent to cover a little church out here by this textile mill over here. And I went out there at the church, and they had a big stove in the middle, a big pot-bellied stove for heat. Most of the people in there just had little thin coats on. It was a cold day. It was as cold as today, except it was cloudy and a little bit damp, very miserable. Most of the men just had on little sweaters. I didn't see a person in there that was anyways dressed what you'd call nice. They were just working people. And this minister, or the pastor of the church, he got up first and he said, like his whispering, says, now brother so-and-so's out there in the vestibule. Now before he comes in here, I want to talk to you people. Said, we have to make him up $100 to pay his expenses here. Said, he's come all the way from Texas to talk to you people, and says we have to make up $100 to pay his expenses. Now here were these people from this textile mill, probably making the minimum wage, which was 40 cents an hour at that time. And they making that man up $100 to come in there and talk to them about trying to better their working conditions, to talk to them against the very thing that was there to try to help them. Those were the things that was hardest for me to understand. A church who was supposed to be looking after the welfare of their members, not to want to see them earn more. I'm glad to see a lot of change in the attitude of ministers. But it seemed that particularly most of the southern churches, I think they had an idea that they would get less money in the collection plate if they had to pay union dues, not stopping to realize that they could get a little more in their paycheck, they might have a little more money to give to the church. There are other churches who, for different reasons, were against the union. Some because they thought it was a sin to belong to a secret organization. But for the most part, I think that it was the pressure put on them by the mill owners, because the mill owners, textile mill owners, had a lot to do with the churches. A lot of the mill villages, they owned the church, and they owned the building, and they owned everything else, and they were. I've heard those old textile people say they was brought in the world by a company doctor, went to a company school, and the company church, and the company undertaker would bury it. I'm proud of the labor movement and the headway we've made in the South. And as I've often said, a labor union is not perfect. It's run by people. We make mistakes. The labor movement is the only thing I know anything about that's trying to do something to help the conditions of the working people. I don't know of another organization that's formed primarily for that. And that's why I belong to it, because I think that workers have to have a way to voice their complaints. I feel that when I go out to apply for a job and I work for a company, that I'm in business with them, that I'm selling them the only thing that I have to sell, and that's my labor. I think I should have something to say about what it's worth. I think that they should sit down and sign a contract with me, so that we can work together in cooperation, and me to be sure that I'm getting paid for what the job's worth. Not only that, I think that workers have a right to talk to their supervisors about decisions they might make. Now there's people, and I run into them even today, who will say, well, he gave me a job, and I ought to do what he says. And if I don't like it, I could quit. That's true. But I don't think the boss gives you a job. I think he hires you. He wouldn't give you a job if there wasn't one there. He wants a worker. It's more true today than it was even 20 years ago. As in our industry, we were more or less family-owned business. Most all the clothing plants were owned by families. That's not true today. Most all clothing plants and cotton garment plants and all the apparel are owned by companies who have no relation to the clothing industry. These big conglomerates have bought up Borden Milk Company, International Shoe Company, steel mills, Litton Industries. They are buying these garment plants. There is no more relationship between an owner of a business and the worker. Once was a time you'd go down and you could sit down with a man who owned the business or had the majority stock in it. You sit down to him and you could appeal to him on some kind of a humanitarian basis. But that's not true today. When you go in to talk to a president of a company, even, he's hired as president of the company. Maybe he has some stock in it, but he's hired. He's got to think about his job too. And I think workers need to be organized today more than ever before, because it's a cold-blooded business. And you're more or less like a machine, and you make a profit or you're out. And you have no one you can appeal to, because everybody in that industry just is a hired, even the managers are hired, and they have to produce or they don't stay there. I get a little bit worried sometimes as to what is going to happen to the country. Might be getting a little off the line here a little bit, because you take the automobile business. Few companies own and make all the automobiles. It's becoming that way in clothing. In the bakery industry, I believe I'm correct in saying 5 companies produces all the bread that is made in this country. And when they talk about, everybody gets concerned about big labor. Here we are, about 100 in our industry. There's about 300,000 members. Well, that's not even about 60% of clothing organized. They talk about big labor. I wonder what's going to happen to labor if industry keeps to get growing into these conglomerates and becoming, well, I think that it's going to be able to, if something's not done about it, it can control the government. I get frightened. I was talking to a friend of mine the other day. He's 86 years old. And I marvel at how he looks to the future. You would think that by talking to him that he'd think, well, what's the use? You know, I'm not going to be here much longer. But the way he looks at things and talks, and he says, I'm scared to death. You know, he says to me, I'm scared to death. Some nut may push that wrong button some of these days. And that's the way I think that we all should feel about it as we grow older. We shouldn't just say, well, I had a person say to me, well, it don't matter to me what happens, I'm not going to be around long to see it, you know. There's so many people feel that way about it. I was, one of our members the other day was relating to me as something happened to him in the plant, and I was sitting and listening. I guess he didn't think he was getting through to me. He said, well, you just don't understand. Said, you're, somebody my age said, you don't understand. I said, well, I don't know. I said, I've been where you have, but you haven't been where I am yet. So you wait till you get my age and see if you understand. I think I understand a little better than you think I do. I hardly know what else to say. I think that I would like for you people, I might talk all day and might have some things in your mind you might like to ask me. I'd rather that any of you have anything you'd like to ask me. Well, I'd be glad to try to answer it.
It's interesting that you mentioned your fear of big business, because it seems to me more and more